Our next unit of study is totalitarianism or fascism, where you end up with a country that is being run by a strong, very strong leader, and that leader becomes kind of the identity of that nation, and people have to have extreme loyalty to that particular person or that particular group, as opposed to having particular loyalty to the institutions of government and to what that country stands for. So let's dive right in and see kind of how this can occur. So when we look at the rise of totalitarianism or fascism, we need to connect it to the last unit. The last unit was nationalism, and so what we really had in nationalism is we have a bunch of new nations forming, and in the modern era, what you have are brand new nations forming. You have some struggles to form those nations, and with the people, and the groups of people within those nations needing to work together. This is also an era where we start to see democracy really blossom and try to work, but a lot of these places haven't really dealt with democracy, and so what happens is democracy is a fairly new concept, and so when a nation is then faced with a test, some kind of a crisis that hits that nation, it really puts that new democracy or form of government to the test. And if that government can deal successfully with that particular crisis, then people start to gain some faith in that new system of government. But when that government can't deal with that crisis very well, people lose faith, and then they start looking for other ways to help solve their problems. And so, we've had a number of crises hit the world. World War I, World War II, we've had the Great Depression. More recently, we had the Great Recession of 2007. If you remember, the Great Depression was back in the early 1920s, so about 100 years ago. But we've also had a Great Recession back in 2007 as well, which was only maybe 10 years ago. So not that long ago. But once again, how these new governments deal with the crisis really sort of affects the outcome of the path of what that nation's going to end up taking. So to be pretty simple about it, if the nation's able to deal successfully, people start to feel like, hey, this new government works, and once again, they give some faith to that. If the government can't deal with that, in general, what happens is they look for someone who can step in and solve the problems, and sometimes they turn to a strong leader who then takes control of the nation and sort of overrides what the government's able to do. And the people start putting their faith in the person as opposed to the government. And that's how we can lead to totalitarianism, which is one person or a small group of people have total control over all aspects of government. And that's why it's called totalitarianism. So let's move on and look at the next aspect of this. We'll look at a number of examples of how this kind of works out, and these first sets of examples are all nations that have had democracy for a really long time. They're pretty comfortable with that form of a government, and so when a crisis hits, the people are willing to give them some leeway and some time for the government to solve the problem. So let's take a look at Great Britain, which was one of the oldest democracies in the world, and in fact they were one of the very first ones to have this. But let's take a look at a major crisis to him, the Great Depression back in the early 1920s. What they did as a government to solve the problem of the Great Depression is they did a number of things. They raised taxes on the people who could afford to pay those taxes, because that brings money into the government, which then allows the government to dole that money out to people who are in need and really struggling during times like the Great Depression. They also issued high protective tariffs that would protect the industries in Great Britain, companies that are making products and selling them abroad. These protective tariffs would incentivize people to continue to buy the stuff made in Great Britain as opposed to bringing things in from other parts of the world that won't help the people of Great Britain. Because one of the problems you have in a Great Depression is people become unemployed and they can't make money. Well, if you can keep people employed because people are buying the products, that's what you want to do, and that's what those protective tariffs are meant to do. They also lowered the interest rates, which make it easier for companies that are struggling to borrow money. And once they can borrow money, then they can have more money to hire people and get their businesses going again until the Great Depression, is over. And it just kind of keeps business is flowing, and so you want to do that. So they did those things, and what we saw is, you can't solve something like the Great Depression overnight. It takes a little time, but the people had faith in their government, and over time it was a slow but steady recovery, and things worked out. And so people once again had faith in their government, but they already sort of had some faith. But in this case, democracy prevails. People didn't turn away from democracy and look for some person who could just solve their problems right away. They gave it some time, and things worked out. If we look at other Scandinavian countries, also hit by the Great Depression, countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they also had established democracies. So people were willing to give those governments some time to work through some of the problems, and gave them some leeway there. What did they do in Scandinavian countries? They raised taxes as well, but they used those taxes to put people back to work. Because if people are out of work, they can't spend money, they can't buy food for their families, they can't survive. So you need to put people back to work. So what they did is they raised taxes on people who were still able to pay taxes. And then they said, look, we're going to build a bunch of dams, bridges, buildings, and you know what? We need workers to do that. So they hired a lot of their citizens to build these things, but what that does is it puts those people back to work, and then you can pay them for that work, and it gets money flowing again. They raised the pensions. Pensions are retirement plans. And so people who were now retired and were relying on that money from their pension to help them survive now that they can't work anymore, they kind of increased the amount of money that those people would receive. And what that does is it puts more money back into the economy, because those people have more money to spend on food and shelter and other kinds of things. They provided subsidized housing. So if it was people were struggling to pay their rent, the government was giving them a little bit of money to help them pay their rent in the meantime until they could get back on their feet. And then people who were unemployed and couldn't find a job doing some of these things, the government was able to give them some money in the meantime to help get them through as well. And what do we see? Once again, a slow but steady recovery. People had faith in their governments. They gave them some time to do this, and they recovered. And once again, democracy prevailed, and people had faith in their government. We kind of did the same thing here in the United States. We took those examples. We were hit really hard by the Great Depression, but we also had a long history of democracy here. What did we do? We raised taxes. We built dams, bridges, and buildings as well. We created the welfare program for people who were not making enough money, who were really struggling. The government gave them some money to help get them through, so they had money to go buy food and shelter and all those kinds of things. Our farms and businesses were really struggling, so the government gave some money and cheap loans and things like that to these different farms and businesses to keep them afloat until we could recover from the Great Depression. And then we made some major changes to the stock market, because the stock market was one of the major problems that helped cause the Great Depression. And so made sure that people weren't doing reckless things with people's money that they had invested and stuff like that. And so made some reforms there to kind of solve the root cause of the problem as well. And what happened? Slow but steady recovery, and we recovered, and democracy prevailed. We fixed that problem. So in all of those examples, people had faith in their democracies, these new forms of government, and some of these places had a democracy for a really long time, but they gave them time to fix the problem, and the problem eventually was fixed by the government, and people continued to have faith in those governments. Some other examples where things didn't work out as well is an example such as Germany after World War I. And after World War I, Germany was blamed for causing World War I. And so the winning nations like Great Britain, the United States, really sort of blamed Germany for causing all of those problems and wanted Germany to pay back all these countries for having to fight the war in the first place. So they also forced Germany into becoming a democracy. So here's Germany, who had never been a democracy before. They had a Kaiser, they had sort of a one person or almost like a kingship type of government beforehand, was now forced to become a democracy because they were on the losing side, and the winning sides happened to be democracies, and they sort of forced democracy on Germany. So they're a bit unfamiliar with how well a democracy can or cannot work. But they lose the war, and then afterwards, Germany now has to deal with the aftermath of the war, right? They have to rebuild their country. It's been bombed and destroyed, so their economy is in shambles. They have no way of producing things. Lots of people are out of work. Lots of people have been killed, all that kind of stuff. So if you can imagine, that country is not in a great place. So they're really struggling to rebuild and to pay back all these other nations that were fighting against them. And that was billions and billions of dollars. And back then, that was a heck of a lot of money. So not only did they need to pay people back, but they had to pay to rebuild. And so where are you going to get that money? Well, the government tried to figure this out and did a number of things to try to solve these problems and get more money, but it was not helping very quickly. And people lost faith in this new democracy, in this new form of government pretty quickly because it wasn't solving the problems. So what did they do? They turned to somebody who started to promise them that they could make make Germany, a great country again and turn it back into the great nation that it was before. And so that person just happened to be Adolf Hitler, and he really promoted the idea that, if you put faith in him, he can make Germany great again. And a great nation like it used to be before World War I and all that kind of thing. And so they lost faith in the democracy, but they started to put faith into one person who promised them all kinds of things, and that they would make Germany this wonderful nation that it used to be. And so they sort of turned to that leader and put their faith in one person. Which leads us to another concept which is very similar to totalitarianism, but this is known as fascism. And totalitarianism really is much more about one group of people or one person having total control over what happens in a country. Fascism is more of a philosophy, right? And we'll talk about how this is a little bit different. So many countries lost faith in their new democratic governments when those governments couldn't solve some of the crises that those places were facing. And they turned to fascism, which is a belief that only total loyalty to a nation can make it great again. So totalitarianism is a form of government where you have power placed in very few hands of people and they have total control over everything. But fascism is a belief that in order for your country to become great again, you must have total loyalty to your nation and do everything for your nation in order for your nation to become great again. And so it's a little bit different. So these fascist leaders, like Adolf Hitler, like Mussolini, who you see here from Italy, and some others, they were very charismatic. They spoke really well. They kind of appealed to people's emotional side, and people were upset and angry that their country was doing so poorly and they were struggling. And so they really kind of appealed to people's emotions. They came through with all kinds of promises. We'll revive the economy. We're going to fix that. We're going to punish those people that have put us in this tough spot and get revenge on them. We're going to restore order and national pride and build up and become a great nation again. And only they can do this. Nobody else can do this. It's because of them and their greatness that they're going to be able to pull the country out of the dumpster and turn it into a great nation. You need to have faith not only in them, but in total dedication to your nation to make this thing happen. And with their leadership, we can get there. So they emphasize loyalty to the state. You must be obedient to the leader and do whatever they tell you, and that's how they're going to bring order to the state. In order to do this, you might have to give up some of your freedoms and rights and allow the police to come in and check on you and do those kinds of things where normally you would have freedom and privacy and things like that, but you're going to give some of that up to get back that order that you want. They're going to get rid of all the opposition. They think the opposition or anybody who kind of speaks poorly about them, that they are, they're the enemy, and we need to get rid of those people because they're not on board with what we need to do. They suppress the press. They get angry at the press that says things negatively about them, and so they're going to control what the press is able to say about them, and that becomes very dangerous because our press is the one institution that can hold people accountable. And if you continually bash the press or make the press seem like they're the enemy, then the press can't tell the people the truth, and they can't hold any people in government accountable to their actions. And so this kind of relates to totalitarianism, right? Total control in the hands of one group. So you have a fascist mentality, which can lead to a totalitarianism type of regime where now everybody's put faith in these few people's hands and they control kind of everything. A few other examples where this has occurred was Russia, or at the time the Soviet Union, right? So we had the fall of communism, and this is much more of a recent example, like in the end of the 1980s, something like that, the early 90s. You had the fall of communism in Russia, and that led to democracy, and they still have a democracy today, but it's sort of run a little bit differently. But what happened is once communism fell and they changed over to democracy, they also changed over their economic system. And so they changed it from kind of a communist system where government controls everything to now, hey, private ownership. Everybody can start their own businesses and do what they want. Well, if you can imagine, changing over your economy is going to take a little while, and that's not easy to do. So they struggled. They had high unemployment. There was still a lot of corruption in government, kind of left over from the old communist ways, and that's just how things were done. And so there was a lot of corruption in government, which made life difficult for a lot of people. And people started to lose faith in this new democracy that they were not used to, because it didn't seem to be working out very well, and it wasn't solving problems for the people. And so they started to turn to a guy known as Vladimir Putin. And he's still in charge in Russia today, but he kind of came in and said, look, we're going to go back and regain the glory of Russia that we once had, but you need to put your faith in me and do what I say, and we'll do that. So he made all kinds of promises to make Russia a great country again. And what does he do now? He has control of the media, their state-run TV that only puts out what he wants them to put out. He imprisons a lot of the opposition leaders that are there in Russia who don't like what he's doing. Yeah, he just throws them in prison, arrests them for things. He's had people killed. He rigs the elections so that way it looks like overwhelmingly he wins these democratic votes all the time, but really they're kind of rigged. And so he wins anyway, but there's not really anything you can do about it. He starts building up his military again to become a strong military nation. And then he spies on his own citizens. So if people are getting out of line or talking bad about him, he can find that out and he can throw them in prison or get rid of them or whatever he needs to do. So he gets rid of that opposition. So he's really kind of taken total control again. We've also seen that in Egypt more recently. Recently, they've turned to a democratic government, but they had their nation was just struggling in general with high unemployment. They were really struggling to provide jobs for young people and things like that. Lots of corruption going on in the government. And so people really lost faith in that. They began to protest. And as the protesters were becoming more and more powerful, the government called the military in to maintain order and put down these protests and send people back home. And so the military was the one organization that still sort of functioned and had a lot of the power because they had all the weapons, right? And so people started to really lose faith in the democratic government that they had because of the corruption and the lack of jobs and things that the government was supposed to take care of. But they turned to a military leader because he seemed to be the one person that could kind of hold everything together. And what he did is he overthrew the president of the democratic government and he took control. And once he's taken control, now he controls the weapons, he controls the police force, he controls the military. People don't have much they can do to fight back against somebody who controls all the weaponry in a country. So he takes control of the country. He then takes control of the media. He starts imprisoning opposition leaders, so people who may want to run against him in a presidential election or things like that, he throws them in prison. He starts rigging the elections once again to make it look like he's winning all of these things in a fair and equal way, but he really isn't. He's scaring people so they don't go to the polls who may vote against him, and those kinds of things. So he's going to build up his military. and make sure that he's always seen as a very strong person. So in all of these later examples, people have lost faith in their democracies, and what they do is they find a strong man who steps in to fill the void, and those people end up taking total control with a promise to fix the country. But you must have total faith in those people.